Hello friends, this is the second video of week number 5 of the process mining course. In this video, I'm gonna explain the rule-based conformance checking. The rule-based conformance checking, when you have some rules inside your organization and you want to check the conformance of cases across the organization. So you have sometimes a flow constraint, which is some constraints based on the order of activities or the execution of mandatory activities. That's what we call a flow constraint. For example, you may assume that every object that has been repaired should be tested. That's a flow constraint. So this is based on the sequence of activities. Also, it may be a mandatory activity. Like, for example, a specific activity should be executed at the beginning of every trace or at the end of every trace. For example, a patient should register inside the hospital before taking the medicine. The second type of constraint is a service level agreement or the temporal constraint, which you have some rules within the organization for the performance of some activities. For example, the waiting time between two specific activities should not exceed 1 hour, or the execution time for the cases inside the organization should not exceed 1 week. That's what we call temporal constraint. And the third constraint is related to resources, who should execute a specific activity that can be executed within the organization's system. So these are the rule-based conformance checking. So the first one is the flow compliance checking, where we detect the rules for specific activities or for the relation between activities. The first thing that we usually go after is to check for the mandatory tasks. We can do that using the minimum frequency aggregation. As you can see here, the register has a minimum of 1. That 1 means that at least the register activity has been executed at least 1 time inside every case of the event log. The repair complex here, for example, it means that it can happen. There can be some cases without the repair complex activity there. So that's what we call a mandatory task. A mandatory task is a task that should be executed for every case inside the event log. We can detect that using a minimum. We can do also the forbidden or the prohibited rework inside the event log by changing that into the maximum, as we will see later. The second type of conformance checking or compliance checking is called temporal compliance checking. So here we have the time between two activities, and we need to filter out the cases that does not comply with our rules. For example, here, if I have the time between the informer user and the repair simple should not exceed 1 hour. So that's a rule inside the organization. We need to single out the cases that has violated this rule. Also, this is like the time elapsed between two activities, or they directly follows time. Okay, we have another temporal compliance checking which is a performance of the cases inside the execution time of cases inside the event log. So sometimes we have a regulation that a case should not exceed 1 hour inside the event log. So we can do that using a performance filtering, as we will describe later. The third type of conformance checking is the resource, where we have some rules to define who can execute a specific activity inside the organization, or the handoffs between two resources, what types of resources should be there. So let's take our first example here. Here is the repair example event log. I will share both the links for both the repair example and sepsis cases below this video in the description. So here we have an event log that has been captured within the organization. This event log has been captured while we are executing already the activities, and we are we are handling cases inside the organization, it's always better to filter out the cases that has not been finished in the event log, because sometimes these kind of cases that by default, by definition, they violate the rules that we have within the organization. For example, this is the repair example event log. In the repair example event log, there is an activity called archive repair. This activity tells us that the case has been already executed and it's done, so it's not going anymore. So all the activities that belongs to the cases that has been through the archive repair has been executed. So I'm gonna make a filter to keep only the cases that has been finished. It's gonna be an attribute filter, and I'm gonna make an archive repair, and here I'm keeping the cases that has been through the archive repair. So now I have the cases that has been finished inside the organization. The first step, as we mentioned, is to check for the mandatory cases. For example, here we assume that every case should have a test repair and every case should be registered and analyzed. We can do the mandatory check by changing the frequency to a minimum. So here the minimum reports the minimum execution, the minimum number of instances of every activity inside the cases. Here I have the minimum of the register activity is 1, which means that at least it happens at least once for every activity, for every case. And the analyzed effect is the same, so it means that it happens at least once for every case. However, the repair complex, it happens at least 0, which means it can happen or it cannot happen. So it means it's not a mandatory, it's an optional task. And there is a test repair, the minimum for test repair is 1. So this is what we call a mandatory task. You can also detect the repetition of activities by filtering, by bringing the maximum. So for example here, it means that the register has only executed once for every case. Analyzed effect is the same. The test repair has been executed sometimes 4 times. Like you have 4 instances of the test repair inside the case. So this is a rework inside the event log. So this is the first thing to check for the rule-based conformance checking. The second type of the conformance checking is the flow. We need to have a regulation for this event log that tells us all the traces has been through test repair. So how to do that? First, let me bring it to the case view, and then I make a filter to filter the cases that has been through that activity. So we have all the cases that has been through the test repair. That means bring me the cases that has been through the test repair. However, we need to check the cases that violates basically this regulation. In order to do that, we just reverse the filter. So remove the cases that has been through the test repair, and the rest is gonna be the cases that violate the regulation. And the result is an empty event log, which means all the cases that has been executed inside this organization has been through the test repair, which means all the cases do not violate the regulation. Another flow regulation rule that we can have is in this event log, we have 2 types of repairs. We have the simple and the complex repairs. We have a regulation that every repair has been tested. We can do that by making a filter, a pass filter. Anyway, we have already tested that all the cases has been through the test, but in order to show you the use case, we can do that too. Here I report the repair simple or the repair complex, and it's eventually followed by. So here the cases, the cases goes through either a repair simple or a repair complex. So it's an or operation here, and then it's eventually followed by a test. So that brings me the cases that conforms the rule. But that's not what we want. We want to have the cases that violates the regulation. So I'm gonna make a remove, and then the remove is gonna filter out the cases that do not violate the regulation. So we have an empty event log, which means all the cases comply with this rule. So let's remove this filter. And yeah, so now we have the flow of this event log, and we've checked it for the test repair, for the mandatory activities, and for the flow, like if like certain activity follows another activity. Let's take another event log, which is a sepsis case, and repeat the same process there. So this is the sepsis cases event log, which describes the execution of a process inside a hospital for patients of a sepsis disease. So we have a registration. So every patient should go through a registration, and it should be through emergency room triage and emergency room sepsis triage. The emergency room sepsis triage is like a doctor which classifies people whether they have the disease or not. So this is the use of this activity here, and that activity is a mandatory activity. Okay, so the first step that we need to do there is to filter the cases that has been finished there. So in this event log, we have releases. The release means that the patient has left already the hospital. Let's make a filter. So now we will have only the cases with a release. We can do that using an attribute filter. The activity that we have for that attribute, the values for the activity is gonna be release 1, release A, B, C, D, and E. So this is the cases that has been already executed and finished inside the hospital. So this is the first step that we have. The second step is to check for the mandatory activities. Here we have the registration. It means that the minimum the minimum emergency room registration is 1, which means it has been executed at least once for every case. The same for emergency room triage. But here we have an issue. Emergency room sepsis triage has a minimum of 0, which means there are some cases that has not been checked by the doctor, has not been classified for sepsis, and they have been assigned and continued within the department to deal with sepsis. So let's make a filter that makes sure that brings us the cases that violates this regulation. So in this event log, we have a rule that tells us that all the cases should go through the sepsis triage, emergency room sepsis triage. So let's bring it to the case view again, and we make a filter. It's gonna be an attribute filter, because here we are checking for an existence of activity, an execution of an activity. So here we are going to make an emergency room sepsis triage, and we are going to make it a remove. So the remove is gonna filter out the cases that comply with this rule, and it brings me the cases that violates this rule. So here we have it's only one case that hasn't been through the sepsis triage, and as you can see, it's pretty strange, because the emergency room registration happens after the execution of emergency room triage and taking some kind of medicine before even the registration. So it's pretty weird. And yeah, so you can get dig deeper into details for this specific case with the ID KX. So this is the first flow conformance checking. The second conformance checking can be the, let's first filter the emergency room subset triage filter. Now we have only the filter for the cases that has been finished. So now we have a regulation inside the hospital that tells us that the time between these two activities should not exceed an hour. So we need to make a filter to bring us the temporal violation here. So I'm gonna make a filter. This filter is a pass filter because it's between two activities. And then I will have an emergency room registration eventually followed by the emergency room triage, okay? And the time is less than 1 hour. That's the rule that we have, right? So this is the rules. We need to bring the cases that violates the regulation within the organization. So I'm gonna make a remove and then I'm gonna click OK. That brings me the cases that violate this regulation. So here I have the case ID. I see it violates this regulation. As you can see, actually, the emergency room registration follows the emergency room triage, which is pretty weird. And here, for example, the case LD, it has an emergency room registration followed by emergency room triage, and the waiting time between these two activities is 1 hour and almost a half. So it means that it violates the regulation. So that's the temporal. This temporal regulation it's a flow temporal basically. So it's between two activities. It's an execution time of activities, the waiting time between two activities. We can do something different. So I have a regulation that tells me that all the cases that has been executed inside this event log, the execution time for a case should not exceed 1 week. Let's do that. So I'm gonna make this time is gonna be a performance filter because the performance filter works on the case duration, as you can see here. This is the performance measures that we considered. So we selected the case duration. You can also have the waiting time, the other metrics that you have as a performance measures, but we will have a case duration and we will select the cases that are not compliant with this regulation. So I'm gonna make it, well, we can make it like we can make it the cases that takes longer than 1 year, because as you can see, it's a very long execution time in this event log. So here we have 7 cases that violates this temporal rule. As you can see, there is this case here and this case. It takes months, like it takes like 12 months between the release A and the return emergency room. So that causes a problem there. Mostly it's gonna be due to the transformation of an event log or something, like something happened while extracting the event log from the system or processing the event log. So that's the case here. Okay, so this is the temporal rule-based conformance checking. So the third rule-based conformance checking can be based on a resource. Let's return back to the repair example event log. So here we have all the cases that has been already executed. In this event log, we have the resource attribute, which describes who has executed a specific task. So there are two types of resource rules. We can have resources like handoffs between resources. Like, for example, we assume that the resource that performs the repair and the resource that performs the test are different. In order to do that, we can make a filter, and this time is gonna be a pass filter. So here we have a repair simple or a repair complex followed by test. We can make it an eventually follows. And then we require a different value over the resource attribute. So it means the cases that go through repair simple or repair complex, then test repair, there is a difference on the attribute that is called resources. You can select, by the way, any other attribute, but in our case, we need to cover the resources, and here it's different. So the values are different between the resource who executes the test repair and the resource who execute the repair simple and complex. And then I'm gonna reverse the filter to be a remove, and then I'm clicking OK. It brings me an empty event log, which means that all the cases inside this event log, they do not violate the regulation. So this is the first type of resource rule. The second one can be for a specific activity. Like, for example, I have a test repair here. I want to make sure that the test repair can be executed by specific people, specific group of people. So we can make an attribute filter. The attribute filter, because it's like a where condition from the database. So here you have the attribute which is called activity, the activity labeled test repair, and secondary attribute which is like an AND between these two values, and the test repair, sorry, and this is like the resource. You can select any other attribute, by the way, but here we take the resource and, for example, bring me the tester 1, 2, 3 cases, the cases that has a test repair that has been executed by these resources here. And then we have like 50% of the cases has been tested by tester 1, 2, and 3. So in this video so far, we have explained the rule-based conformance checking via the flow, like when we were checking the existence of some activities, the mandatory activities, or the flow of two activities, the relation of two activities together. The second type of the rule-based conformance checking was the temporal one, where we check the waiting time between two activities or the execution time of the entire cases. And the third type is the resources, when we check the execution of some activities by specific resources. And the next video, we will explain the model-based conformance checking. Stay tuned.